Soil sampling, I was asked to speak to soil sampling. We've been in the business for 15 years now. A lot of what we do is focused on dairy, a lot of it's focused on soils, and we take well over 1,000 soil samples a year, so we're beginning to know what we're talking about. Troy earlier told you to think about soil as a bucket. Change of tack. Let's think about soil the way I always think about it. It's food. It's food for our crops, and therefore ultimately food for our animals and for ourselves. Some of it's that crappy old turnips and cabbage that your grandmother told you was good for you. Some of it's chocolate that will grow absolutely anything. But soil, Leonardo da Vinci back in the day is credited for saying that we know more about the stars and the heavens than we do about the soil beneath the feet. And I think that's still true. Soil scientists are working hard to help us learn about it, but really, we don't know all that we can do. And yet we're relying on it to filter the water, we're relying on it to provide our crops with nutrients. And every day we make decisions on our farms that are affecting it, and whatever we do, we can improve on it. So why do we sample soil? Agronomy and economics. The long and the short of it is, we're in here to make money, to grow crops, to make money on the soil. To really work out what we're doing on the soil, what we can do to help ourselves. We need to know what's in the soil and how the soil's working for us and how we can improve it. Fertility management, that all buys into that. We have to know what nutrients we have in the soil, what nutrients our crop needs, and what we need to add. And troubleshooting problems. You've got crops here, thin patches, thick patches. You want the entire field to look the best it possibly can if you want to get the best in your bunker. And then monitoring trends year on year. How are things going? We've produced a fertility management plan now. How are we performing against that plan? And now the dirty word in soil science. The soil scientists have worked for decades trying to work out what's happening in the soil and assist farmers to produce the best crops that they can. Now their favorite tool, the soil test, is being used against farmers in terms of compliance activities. But the crux of the whole thing is that we need to have valid information. We can't give a decent interpretation unless we've got a sample that has some sort of level of integrity. Something that we can interpret, something that we can use to move forward and make decisions that will truly make money and make sense. So the key to that is the sampling needs to reflect what you see in the field. You have to sample a field with your eyes open, and you need to be thinking about the crops you've been growing and are wanting to grow. And one of the, just something to also think about on soil samples, the 20 acres of that 1 foot of topsoil is 40,000 tons of soil, and you've got to get that information in a 1 pound bag and send it to the lab. So, first off, before you even head into the field, you need to have a plan. So that this whole concept turns around this whole idea of a relationship between what you test and what you see in the field. I mean, the basic standard sample is the whole field, randomized, wander up and down the field, take a sample from various spots in the field. And that, in the vast majority of cases, is perfectly sufficient for what we're trying to do. But if you've got a variety of little fields all patched together, they're all being managed exactly the same, clump them all together. Benchmark sampling, this whole idea of how have you affected the soil from one year to the next. I mean, it can be as simple as a post driven into the field and going back to that same spot year after year, month after month. In some cases with scientific studies, you're going back week after week. And it's surprising how much things change from week to week. And then we can get onto the GPS-based grid sampling, where you can go out and sample discrete areas in the field, multiple soil tests within the field, bringing back multiple results, can produce some really pretty maps, and can help you focus in on where you really need to focus your attention on fields, big fields especially. It can be very useful. But the key one is smart approaches, that you look at your field, you know what you're seeing, you know what you've seen over the years, and you use that knowledge to guide you, whether it should be split a field into parcels or just to sample the whole thing as one. So any fool can dig a hole in the ground. What we need is a soil sample that's of use to us. And one of the things that Sherry said, that she was focusing in on post-harvest tests. That's not a requirement over on this side of the state. The requirement is still the way it was back in 2004, 2005, which was one sample a year. When you're in a low rainfall area, you're not going to see the drive down. This was focused very much on the west side, where we can have these high fall nitrates and then this wash through in the winter. Now it's gone in the spring. It may not have washed through, it may have denitrified, but our spring tests are minuscule compared with our fall tests. So the fall tests, they're focusing in on September and October. Some of you guys here are also taking fall tests to look at the performance, look at the differences between spring and fall. That's a great thing to be doing. Make sure it's before your final, or not final, but before a manure application rather than directly after. Those soil tests that we take directly after a manure application are really difficult to interpret. There are too many reactions going on in there, and you get numbers that really don't make much sense. Next one, I don't think you need to worry about that. But then when you get a heavy rain after dry, and especially on unirrigated or fields that you've run out of irrigation on during the season, we get these spikes straight after that first rainfall event or first heavy irrigation, and again, they don't really bear any relation to what's truly going on in the field. And in a lot of cases, if you're going to wrap up the season with a final manure application, use that soil test to guide that last application. Simpler in the spring, I put in March or April. It's really just when the soils are beginning to warm up and you're starting the beginning of your season. And again, before you get any manure applications onto that field. Corn side dressing is another one that we do a lot of. It's really quite a useful test. It's been correlated against a huge amount of crop information from the Midwest. It gives a pretty good guide to what top-up nitrogen applications you're going to need as you go towards grain fill on the corn. June, July, 4 to 6 leaves, one of the better times for that, and somewhere 4 to 6 leaf stage of the corn. So tools, well, this is my chance for a plug. N3, we sample all kinds of different soils. We sample at all kinds of different depths with different pieces of equipment. We can go from 6 inches to 6 feet. We've got everything GPS calibrated, including this little fellow who's got it in his bucket. But you know, that generally, almost the best tool you can use is your telephone in terms of soil sampling. Get someone out to do it for you. Most of you guys are not going to be wandering across fields sampling every field, and you're just going to have somebody else do it. So the rest of this may be to a degree redundant, but it is important you know what the guys out there are doing for you. Soil sampling tools, this is just the result of a Google search. I entered soil sampling tools, this is what came up. My favorite, the spade. Everyone who's serious about growing crops should have a spade. It can help you sample the soil. It can tell you a lot about crop rooting. It can tell you an enormous amount about compaction and soil structure. The best tool you could possibly have. A lot of these other ones, I mean, here's your basic soil sampling probe. These are all based around root rooting depth, well, plough depth of soil. It was always the way that we used to sample soil, was we sampled the plough depth of the soil, which is great. They're all 8 to 10 inches. Problem is, you guys are the only guys in the state, the dairy guys, who are policed on that top foot of soil. If you've got guys out there sampling the top 8 inches, where do you put the manure? And top inch or so of the soil. You're getting a skewed result. Whoever's taking your soil sample for you, whether it be you or somebody else, make sure they're sampling the top foot, because you are being policed on it, and if you're getting rogue results, it's meaningless. If you're sampling down to the second foot, that's even more important, because it's even more difficult to get down there. So what you see when you go into the field, well, the ideal, here's a lovely little picture, you stay away from the roads, you stay away from livestock feeding areas or treat areas, you sample areas that are less than 20 acres, you wander around in the field taking lots of different spots. The reality is, we're faced with fields like this that are very variable in the crop. There's an area here that looks like possibly got a trial site on it. Got an area down here that was so wet they didn't plant it. You've got shady wet areas by trees. You've got what's obviously an application error or something down there. So how do you sample that? Well, one of the keys is the basic practicalities of it. This getting the information that's in the top 20 acres, there's 40,000 tons of soil into the 1 pound bag. And think about portfolio theory. You don't put all your money into one stock, because if that stock collapses, you've lost it all. You spread your money over a variety of different stocks. In the same way with soil sampling, you want to have more than just 1 or 2 soil samples that have gone into that. You need to have a portfolio of 15 to 30 cores that will give you a good average of the field. Use a clean bucket. It's not about the cleanliness of the bucket as much as it is about not directly into the bag. You won't get even halfway across the field if you're putting the samples directly into the bag. Walk in a randomized pattern, a zigzag or a drunken circle, whatever it is, just don't walk down the lines that you've ploughed, down the lines that your manure spreaders have taken, and get to the far end of the fields. They're as important to the tonnage in your bunker as the bit right next to the road. And keep your eyes open. Use it as a chance to look at what you're seeing in the crop. Look at the way your management of that crop so far has returned to you in terms of the crop's growth. Try to avoid any unusual areas. If it's something that you're really worried about, then maybe take a separate sample of that. Avoid compacted areas. A, you won't get the probe in the ground. B, you're not getting the yield there. Avoid hot spots where you've had manure application errors. Avoid corn rows if you've been banding fertilizer. And most importantly, this whole thing about the 12 inches, get the bloody probe in the ground. 12 inches, 24 if you're sampling 2-foot samples for CAFO. And that 24 inches, you can't do it like that. In most soils, you can't get down 2 feet by hand. And if you've got any gravel in your soil, you're not going to do it with a probe. A shovel is about your only decent tool. Handling soil, just the basic stuff here, mixing it up, keeping it cool. If you're taking soil samples in September, you'll have a different result, a different nitrate test result, 24 hours of sitting in your pickup. So get it out of the field, get it somewhere cool, or preferably straight to the lab. Labs, choices of labs, there are lots of them out there to choose from. This stamp is a good one to have. It's basically a quality assurance program that proves that that lab has got some repeatability in its results. And tend to look for labs who will give you a bit of advice. They haven't got any player in the game, they haven't got any fertilizer or anything to sell you. advice from labs is usually pretty good. So, you've sampled your soil, you sent it to the lab, you get a bunch of results back and they look like this, and you scratch your head and think, what does that mean? One of the keys is that these should mean something, that you've got these field numbers that you can come back to in 5 years' time, and they still mean what they did when you took the samples in the field. So relate it to a map, relate it to something, names, numbers, it really doesn't matter. But make sure it means something to you in 5 years' time. Milligrams per kilogram, well, that's just parts per million. Milliequivalents per 100 grams, that's too much soil science. Really, one of the keys is the balances between these nutrients, the calcium, magnesium, sodium, how well they're in balance, and you talk to any two soil scientists and you'll get two different sets of advice on where those should be. So looking more at interpretation, one of the best places you can go is extension publications. They're all on the web now. They're some pretty useful places to go. The OSU interpretation field guide, this one, soil test interpretation guide, is good. The field advice guides are good too. They were all based on masses of field trials. So unlike a lot of the guidelines that we're getting that are based on just one or two, this is based on masses of stuff from a lot of field trials, and they're correlated with those trials to prove crop benefits. But looking specifically at nutrients and fertility at pH, go-to guys, people like crop consultants and agronomists, and then just simple stuff like comparing samples. This was the piece that you took from the good field, this is the piece that you took from the bad field. How can you compare them? What interpretations can you make from that? But avoid these rogue results. If you've got results that really don't look straight to you, go back to the lab. They'll retest for free, or they may give you some reasoning for why those numbers are so different. So going down through it, pH, the real importance of pH is that it affects how available all the nutrients are to the crop. Big variations in pH, really low or really high pH soils tend to tie up nutrients, make them less available to the crops. Ideal 6 or 7 for corn, higher for alfalfa. It's less of a problem on those fields next to the dairy that are getting oodles of manure, but as you get further away where the fertility is limited, pH becomes more of an issue. This was more focused at the west side, folks, that we did last week, but these low pH soils, you start increasing the pH by 1 part, you'll get a ½ ton of dry matter a year yield increase, which will pay for lime in a hurry. Fall nitrate test. Well, the guidelines, no. All I'd say is that you don't want to go too low on this. You know, the states put in this high level they don't want you to go above, but you don't want to be shorting your crop. You're here to grow big crops, to put lots of feed in your bunker to produce lots of milk. Anything below 8 parts per million, you can guarantee you've shorted your crop. Corn is more difficult because there's a lot of nitrate released from the organic matter in the soil that the corn hasn't taken up. It doesn't take up much nitrogen after it tassels. So once the soils get warm and the bugs in the soil are really working and producing nitrogen, there's no crop there to take it up. 20 parts per million, if you can hit that every year, you've done really well. So the ones that are tricky ones, pasture fields are very difficult to manage, difficult to interpret. You never know on any one given square foot who crapped there last and when. And for high organic matter soils, again, very difficult to manage because of that nitrogen release that's more climate-based than than your management base. WSDA says no more than 30 parts per million, which is 100 pounds an acre. So is that really a problem? It's a big question. I mean, that 100 parts per million was drawn out of somewhere. Sorry, 30 parts per million. The tension on that one was mainly drawn on the west side, where we don't see anything left in the spring. 100 pounds per acre there in the fall. We're lucky to find 10 pounds per acre there in the spring. For you guys, perhaps less of a problem, other than if it's being driven down. Are real. They're financial losses. 100 pounds, so that 30 parts per million on 100 acres, if you're driving that down out of the root zone, that's $5,000 for every 100 acres. Now, if you're doing that year on year, you're losing a lot of money. Nitrogen that could be used in other areas on other fields to produce more crops, so you'd buy in less feed. Pre-side dress nitrate test, like I said before, it's been well researched. Look at the crop, use the test to guide you. But don't let that overrule what you see in the crop. The overall guidance is that over 30 parts per million is unlikely to respond to is unlikely to give you an economic response to nitrogen added. Not the case if the crop looks like it needs the help, so use the crop. Again, 30 parts per million is roughly 100 pounds per acre. If you're below that 30 parts per million, add enough nitrogen to build it back up to the 100 pounds an acre. Phosphorus, we saw a couple of pictures of boffins in labs, but this is what labs look like now. Barely a human hand touches the soil. On the west side, we're interpreting with a Bray test. It's a really volatile test. A lot of people don't like it. We're seeing a lot of volatility from year to year, and we're seeing a lot of volatility around manure application. The Eastside-Olsen test is based on higher pH soils. It is a more reliable test, although there are still those big variations on heavily manured soils. And this 25 to 50 parts per million is a good area to be in. Good luck in getting down to that sort of level on soils that have had historically been near dairies. But it's the tip of the iceberg, really, because what you're testing, what both of those tests look at, is what phosphorus is readily available to the soil, to the crop. The soil hangs on to phosphorus very tightly, and it's really just showing you that little piece that's available to you. So then when we look at the whole environmental side of this, the phosphate losses, we've got phosphorus impaired water bodies in the state. They're almost exclusively focused on places where soil has entered the water. The phosphorus binds tightly to the soil. If the soil doesn't leave the field, you won't have a phosphorus impaired water body beside you. So the WSDA guideline standards, 50 parts per million on Olsen. It's I think Stu, you were there too when this was discussed. Here's one of my bugbears. All your nutrient management plans were focused in on balancing your farms for nitrogen. Back in 2004, all that had been done. All these offices full of people were sitting around saying, well, what next? We've done all these nutrient management plans, we've got them all next. Lo and behold, 6 months later, we were having conferences about phosphorus, and now we were talking about a phosphorus standard. There was a ridiculous meeting over in Prosser where it was a bit like pin the tail on the donkey. There was so little science based in coming out with the standard. The only good side of that is we still have the hierarchy in WSDA who are involved in that and who are prepared to use that as a very rough guideline. What frightens me about it is a generation or two of inspectors to come who just get that passed on, and that's the standard you're going to live to, because we're not going to be able to get there. Anyway, off that one. Potassium. Potassium is called K because the Latin for potassium is K, NPK. Your aim, you want to be greater than 250 parts per million for decent crop growth. If you're looking to produce a lot of dry cow feed, you need to get it off your fields where you're lower than 400 parts per million. Your forage crops are consuming a huge amount of K, so don't underfeed K, especially on fields that you're not getting much manure to. Manure contains a lot of potassium too, goes into the cow in the alfalfa and the grass, and it comes back out. So your manure contains a lot of it as well. So then just a little bit on micronutrients, some key ones. Sulfur, it's one of the few that, like nitrate, is leachable. Most of the nutrients in the soil are positively charged and will cling to soil, cling to the soil. Sulfur and sulfate, nitrate, both negatively charged, that's why they leach through. Zinc, it's an important one for corn. Keep it greater than 2 parts per million. Boron, especially important for alfalfa. Keep it above 0.5. Manganese, molybdenum, copper are all in the mix. In most situations, they aren't an important. Then you're not going to see a crop response by applying more, but there are certain situations where they are limiting crop. And then one of the bigger ones in some places is salt levels. A lot of the guidance will say keep it below 4, but if you're above 2.5, you will be seeing crop effects and crop losses. So from soil onto manure, always seem to be weird looking fellows sampling manure. This one's here because it's about timing, and I was going to say it's about agitation, but it's not necessarily about agitation. It's about sampling the manure around about the time that you're sampling, either before or during application, will give you the most accurate result for what you're putting onto the field. Samples, yeah, I won't bother going there. Agitation, if you're going to agitate at the time of application, it's an important thing to be doing when you're sampling. But consider your different sources. One manure test a year. On a lot of you guys' dairies, you've got multiple lagoons, multiple stages. Some are using vacuum scraping tanks. A lot of you got manure separators. You've got a lot of different manures there, which all have different nutrient compositions. So you need to be thinking about that when you're sampling. Your manure settles out. You've got settling stages. You've got some manure that'll be almost entirely ammonia and potassium based because the solids have settled out. You've got some thicker manures, the vacuum style manures, where you may only have 10 to 20% of that nitrogen is there as ammonia. So just to take a blanket, right, it's coming out of the lagoon, it's 50% ammonia, 50% organic, N is not a fair way to look at it. Even if you're using a lot of these quick test methods, make sure you've got samples going into the lab every year to true test them. Liquid, if you're agitating at the time of the pumping, then you need to be agitating at the time that you're sampling to really be a valid sample. So then, and solids and composting, compost, it's like the soil sample thing. It's portfolio theory, taking multiple spots along compost lanes or solid stacks to mix them together and produce a sample that means something when you get it back from the lab. The quick test, the hydrometers, they're really just based on the amount of that they were calibrated for. And therefore constant throughout, not constant throughout the lagoon, but it gives a pretty decent reading on what the whole in the lagoon is testing. Calibration, just really quick on calibration because it's been covered. One of the keys is to keep it simple. You can spend hours mucking around with manure spreaders. If you've got a really even I mean, the ideal is a manure spreader that gives you a nice, even coverage across the field, not lumps. Sometimes we can't avoid the lumps, but assuming you've got a reasonably even application, volume of the load by the application area. Easy to pace off. Modern tractors, you've got a lot of equipment in there that will tell you what area you've covered, whether it be solids or liquids, or even just how many loads do I put on the field. Simple one, the bucket under the big gun. Flow meters are pretty good. The ultrasound flow meters you can stick on the outside of pipes that work really well on everything other than steel pipes. But they're inline ones that some of the custom guys use. They're usually the last thing to get repaired, so they tend not to work anymore. But you've got modern tractors with work rates on the dashboards of tractors. You can use that information. Use that information to help you do calibrations. Another part, a really small part of the nutrient management picture is irrigation water sampling. If you're irrigating, especially if you're irrigating out of a well and you've got nitrate issues, then you're going to be pulling some nitrogen out of the ground with that groundwater. It's not a huge part of the picture, but it is a part of the picture. For instance, for 10 parts per million, which is your drinking water standard, every acre inch is just over 2 pounds of nitrogen. Seems fickle and pathetic, but by the time you've put 12 inches on, that's a good way to growing a cutting of triticale. Sorry about no, that's all I have to say. Surface water sampling. This is more. A lot of this is for your own information and for your own protection. That if you've got a concern about water bodies beside you, just take a test. They're not expensive. It's not actually that dangerous, although she's got a hard hat on and a high visibility vest. But the key is a sterile bottle, which the labs will all supply you with. They have a little reagent in the bottom of the bottle to stop the bugs from carrying on breeding. keys are clean hands, don't mess up the sediment, keep the sample cool again. It's even more important than with the soil sample, and most labs won't stand behind a sample if it's been if you've tested it more than 2 hours ago. These kind of samples are really, what's the word? They don't have good repeatability. It's good, I mean, that's why I'd say it's good for your own information. It's good to have a track record if you've got water bodies alongside you that are being tested regularly, to have some evidence that what you're doing is right, or some information to you that what you're doing needs some is having an adverse effect on water, and so you can correct problems before anybody tells you to. The aim, or two aims actually, less than 200 colonies, a rough rule of thumb is if it's deep enough or big enough water body that you can swim in it, then it should be less than 100 colonies. What are you looking at? You're looking at fecal coliform. Well, fecal coliform is a group of bacteria that are tolerant of warm temperatures. So it's not specifically this has given you a result from of cow manure going into the ditch. It's giving you an indication that there's some level of bacteria there unfortunately it's the state standard. It's also a federal standard, so it's something we're not going to get away from, but it's not very specific. You can also take tests, an E. coli test, which is more specific in terms of whether it's actually a result of something out of an animal gut, but there are no state standards for that. The state standard is the fecal coliform. So another part of the nutrient spectrum is you're feeding the crop, you know what's in the soil, what are you taking off? What's the other side of the picture? Because when you look at how the nutrient management plans that you're all having to live to are written, they're focused in on what is the crop offtake. Well, having worked with several of you guys in the room, I know your crop offtakes are big. In a lot of cases, they're bigger than your farm plan was written for. But without that information, you can't go back and have your farm plan updated to show that. So, forage sampling, to get really good forage samples, one of the best ways to do it is just have a bucket by the bunker and have grab samples go into the bucket, because once it's in the bunker, it's almost inaccessible other than that top foot or so or the front face. So that can give you a good measure of what's coming off in each field, even depending on how tightly you want to sample that. Yield measurement for guys who've got the older equipment. Simple estimation of dry matter in dump box loads, and then counting the loads will give you good yield measurements. With the newer forage harvesters, there's some great stuff out there with giving you yield estimations, giving you dry matter estimations. In some states, in some of the newer kit, the nutrient, the digestibility stuff, and tie that to the GPS. You can now produce both a pretty map of your soil, and also now, like the wheat guys have been doing for a lot of years, GPS maps of how your crop has performed over the field. And all of that ties in and allows you to produce a nutrient balance that actually means something for your farm and your specific situation, rather than relying on the NRCS-based standardized figures. So I'm going to finish with this, but this is one of my pet peeves, is these trucks that are designed to go on roads with high pressure tires out on fields. When we're looking at balancing the farm, utilization of N is the driver to how much they'll allow you to apply. If you're hitting your yields through for any reason, you're reducing the amount of N that you're taking off the field, and you're doing two things. You're reducing that chance that you've got to upgrade your farm plan. You're also leaving nitrogen behind in the field that's giving you these high numbers in your soil tests. So it's all about yield and quality. When I was farming back in England, it was for a big farm management company, and one of our directors was a German agronomist who worked for decades for BASF Science. And when we, as farm managers, would jump up and down saying, claiming these great yields that we had, he would always turn it back to, this is the yield we produced on these trial plots on our test farm. And he was talking about plots that were this big and building the yield up in terms of tons per acre. But on tiny test plots, they were producing half as much again as we were on our very best fields. And his turn back to us every time we bragged about our big yields was, how did you damage it? Why isn't it better than it is? And turning it back all the time. And he was quite quick to say, yeah, you've got climate causing you issues. But back to crop management all the time. And the key to that, every time, is soil care. Because here we've got these crops that we grow with these pretty little roots in the soil, and they're delicate little things. And then we go and do that to them, and we expect them to perform year after year. And it isn't going to happen. And so what should you be looking at? Should you be looking at your maximum achievable yield from an acre? Well, we know that they've achieved 24-ton alfalfa crops in Arizona. I think that's the world record at the moment. And yes, they've got a better climate for us to deal with. But we can do better than we are doing. And that's the challenge, is do the best you absolutely can, because there's a lot more yield out there than we're really seeing. So that's pretty much all I've got to say. Oh, no. This is the result that we see in harvest in wet spots in fields. How are we going to deal with it? I think this sort of thing, this sort of equipment, investing in tire equipment that will allow big trucks, allow big outputs of forage equipment without hammering the soil, and maybe one day we can do what some of the Dutch guys are doing. So, let's leave you with that.
Other questions for Gary?
I got one question. At the very beginning, you mentioned about in some of these scientific studies, they can take the soil sample to the same spot or be apart and see a change or something like that.
We did some work in conjunction with the conservation district in Whatcom County, and it was looking at, well, they were looking at a variety of different things. We were coming in and soil sampling once a week for, I think it was 3 months through the fall, and those numbers changed quite dramatically through the fall. Now that's, you've got a higher rainfall base over where we're doing that in Whatcom County, but we were seeing over double-fold increases in nitrate, with it increasing as it went through those warmer months, and then quite a rapid drop-off as rainfall hit in the later fall. So initially, when the whole nutrient management standard came out, the NRCS's recommendation was that all soil had to be sampled to 2 feet, which was going to be a logistical nightmare for every dairy out there. And what we were seeing is that top foot on west side soils was containing 90% of the nitrogen until you got beyond a certain rainfall threshold in the fall, and it's set at the moment at about 6 inches, that you then start to see that nitrate pushing down. But what was interesting to us was how much nitrate was being released by the soil, especially these smaller rainfall events, and followed by warm weeks were really having an impact. And that was whether the soil was a highly manured soil or whether it was in the forest.